Michelle, let's talk at first off how this country actually created the middle class and when, and with emphasis on the fact that this was an intentional decision because we had the 1800s, a classic two-class system like the rest of the world, right up through the Gilded Age, World War II, and then a golden era for this country. And I bring it up just because as I look back on history, I look at the existence of the middle class in this country as our secret sauce to prosperity for everybody, leading to American hegemony and everybody doing well. So that's my first question. I think a lot of people would be interested to learn about.
And I'm glad you phrased it that way because where we are now is where we were in this country before we created the middle class. And when I say we, I mean political leaders. Um, so imagine that we're just coming out of the Depression. We have a bunch of GIs coming back, veterans coming back from World War II. And the political leaders are thinking, okay, we just got out of the Depression. We have a lot of people coming back. How about if we figure out a way, both for the returning veterans and also for lower and middle income folks like them, to actually become financially stable? So, when I talk about the middle class, people forget that we have one because political leaders created one. And it was not that everybody had to be rich, but it was most decidedly we don't need to have a country of poor people who will never be anything other than poor and who can never achieve the American dream of upward mobility. And so the political leaders in the 1940s and 50s decided that they were going to create the US middle class, and that worked until it didn't.
And so it's interesting. You use the term, not everyone has to be rich, and there's poor people. And that's my next question. It's actually in the very last section of the book, the third to last paragraph, where you say the middle class as we knew it is gone. And personal story, I was born in 67, the youngest of three. And not that people have many reasons to ask me about my upbringing, but if they do, I always say we were solidly middle class back when middle class was the American dream. And my parents bought a house, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths on a quarter acre in the suburbs and stayed there for 60 years. They couldn't believe, given where they came
Mhm.
from, children of poor immigrants. My dad lived without heat or hot water for this first 9 years of his life. They never thought that, they couldn't believe to their dying day, Michelle, how good they had it.
Right,
And consequently, how good I had it, as and my brother and sister.
right.
And then in 1994, I'll never forget this. I was working for one of the big six accounting firms in LA, and NAFTA had been passed the day before, I think, something like
Okay.
that. And I was walking, I was in one of those little cubicles in a typical
Mhm.
office, and I was walking to the men's room, and I run into my favorite partner, and we almost spoke in hushed tones. And we're like, well, I don't know who said which part of this, but the two pieces were the middle class is just about to get bigger, but it's also going to be much lower.
Right.
So punchline being quote unquote middle class does not mean from that day forward and more every day what it meant when we were growing up. How do you define middle class today? And it used to be just I majored in economics. I've been an economics geek forever. It used to have, median household income numbers that you could put in a range, and if you had one kid or four kids, whatever.
Mhm.
It was very simplistic. How do you think about it today?
I think about it in a couple of ways. First is just sort of the definition that I use in the book. When I first started working on this project, which became the book, and it was a long time ago, it's taken me almost a decade to get here. I would talk about the middle class, and people would say, "Well, but if you feel middle class, does that mean you're middle class? Well, if it seems like you have the values of the middle class, does that mean that you're middle class?" And I quickly realized I had to have some sort of numbers. The nowhere does the federal government or state legislatures define the middle class. So I decided to adopt the sort of income range that colleges use when they decide whether or not a middle class student is entitled to have either complete free tuition or partial free tuition. And the reason I decided to use the same band or the same range that colleges use for a couple of reasons. First, they've paid a lot of, smarty pants actuaries or whatever to decide what that range should be. And more importantly, it shifts up or down every year. So if someone reads my book in 10 years, whatever the number is that the colleges use then is what I would be defining as the middle class. But the point that you make in telling your story is one of the sort of approaches I used in the book. When we think of the middle class, we think of the markers of the middle class. So it's not just what you earn, but what can you do with what you earn? So in the book, I talk about the markers and the one that you mentioned involving your parents. It was the ability to buy a home. Home ownership used to be the major marker of the middle class, and that's just not true anymore. We could talk about it in more detail, but there are a lot of people now when they think of sort of housing, it's not can you find a house that you can afford to buy, but can you even find affordable housing to rent? College, either being able to go yourself or being able to help your kids go to college and not have to drown yourself in student loan debt. Can you find a job that pays you 40 hours a week? You're called an employee and not a contractor, and you have benefits. And if you've accomplished all of those things, that means you probably have savings and you don't have a lot of debt. But all of it really comes back to people are going to have to earn enough to have the markers of the middle class. And then at the end of their, life, they sort of look back and say, wow, what a great life I've had.
So you had to come up with this lower middle income LMI term out of necessity because that's the large swath of folks that are living a very different life than the ones that we experience. And I have 4 Gen Z sons. I know you have a couple,
Mm,
and I work with a lot of millennials who are now anywhere from, late 30s to even early 40s. And already I look at their experience. I'm like, well, what was I doing when I was 36? We
right,
owned our first home. We were having our third kid, maybe even moving, new job
right.
and everything like that. And they are just, they're afraid to leave their jobs.
Yes.
They're stuck. And we'll talk more about all those markers, as you say, of middle income. You talk about housing. And as I was reading the book, it just struck me, and I'm familiar with the history of racism in banking and redlining and all of those things. I have a finance background, I understand the credit markets and all that, but it really opened my eyes to how like education and housing are tied at the hip,
Mhm. Yeah.
both in K through 12. And I'll tell you a story also about college, but I want to make sure that we get to your New Deal and the
Uh-huh.
things you're talking about. And we can always work backwards to the relevant history, but I also don't want to do the whole book because I want people to buy the book and read it. So you talk about rethinking education and family-friendly school policies. What are the things? Does that include things like summer school? What is it? What do you mean by the family-friendly school policies? Besides just in addition, obviously, the quality of the education, the
Uh-huh.
safety, the buildings that aren't, don't have vermin running around and actually have heat and air conditioning. Talk a little bit about your New Deal take on education.
Family friendly, by that I primarily mean we need to think about how the K-12 schedule and calendar conflicts in many ways with the working lives of lower and middle income families. So the K-12 schedule is built on the assumption that we are still an agrarian economy. So you need to have 3 months in the summer off because got to bring in the crops, got to go have them out there working. But if you are a normal lower middle income parent, you have to go to work, maybe 9 to 5, 8 to 4, whatever. And in many instances, the school schedule starts too late and ends too early.
Yeah.
And it's just not consistent with people being able to take their kids to school, work, and then at the end of the day of their work day, picking their kids up at the end of the day. And mostly this is true for younger elementary school kids, but also for parents that want to be involved in their children's lives. There's a after school soccer game, or your kid's going to be in the orchestra and there's a performance. It's hard to do that because the schedules are not aligned. But the biggest issue, as you mentioned, it's the summer. All kids have a summer slide. Whether you are high income or you are low income, your children are going to lose knowledge in the summer. The difference is, though, if you are either rich or lower rich, was the other term that I use in the book, you will be able to do things like put your kids in robotics camp or take them to a college campus so they can be in one of those summer enrichment camps. That is not the reality of middle class parents. So their children don't get the educational benefits that rich and lower rich children get during the summers, which means that when they start the school year after that lovely 3-month summer vacation, they've lost a lot of information. So I'm basically saying if we were to start anew and decide when do schools open, both in terms of the month of the year and also the time of the day, how would we set up K-12 education to be more friendly to the realities of lower and middle income families?
Yeah, I never appreciate how lucky I was until we had our own kids. That my mom was a teacher in our district,
Yeah.
and so which I think is an experience you had maybe for a little while
Mhm.
growing up with your dad, where she drove us to school, dropped us off. She went to another school. Hopefully, there was a couple years there when she was in my school that wasn't good, but and then she'd come back and get me.
Exactly.
Yeah, no kidding. And do you have thoughts about pre kindergarten and what we can do there, if anything?
Uh, the fact that there is so much reluctance to make it be universal pre-K um, tells me that we need to be having a conversation that acknowledges that rich children are getting a pre-K experience so that when they start kindergarten, not for all children, but for most children, rich and lower rich children are well ahead of lower income children when you start kindergarten. So if you have kids that are starting that, know their letters and some of them are even reading, well, they have a distinct advantage over children who don't know how to hold a book or which way to turn the page of a book. So it would be great if we're going to say, "Oh, universal pre-K is too expensive," and I don't accept that because there are lots of things that we could do with the federal tax code, with the Internal Revenue Code, if we wanted to get additional income to invest in children. But if we're going to say we don't want to pay for pre-K, universal pre-K that's free, we then need to admit that we don't care
Right.
that a lot of children are starting uh, on at a distinct disadvantage to rich children.
Yeah, and it also, I think, speaks to the another family-friendly school policy idea. Tragically, also, there are a lot of kids in this country whose only square meals are gotten at school, and there's no magic rule that says that doesn't start until kindergarten. And it's crazy because I think we finally did it here in Colorado. Some states make the biggest deal out of the fact that they finally went to full day kindergarten, right?
Exactly.
It's been half day
Mm.
forever. I love the ideas from a content perspective that you mentioned about teaching financial literacy. Maybe not everyone needs a full year of geometry, but what is an APR? What is compound interest? And there's another economics professor, Steve Levitt from the Freakonomics series, who's obsessed with teaching just basic, he calls it data science. It's just
Mhm.
interpreting numbers, to be able to look at a press release on a vaccine and go, yeah, this actually makes a lot of sense,
Exactly.
things like that. And
If I could
community college. What's that?
Yeah. If I could add one thing there, if
Please.
you really wanna set me off, show me what your state requires students to take in order to graduate.
Oh, yeah.
And I will see, like, trigonometry or whatever they call it, algebra 2, whatever they call it in different
Right.
states,
Right.
and I'll say, "Why don't we have statistics or data
Right.
science?" Because more human beings will need to know that just in their general lives or when they get a job, then they'll need to know any version of A, B, D, C, whatever calculus is called in your local high school. We're not thinking in terms of how are we preparing children to be workers, because not everyone's gonna go to college.
Yeah. That's Steve Levitt's entire point you just made for him right there. It's like, what are we doing and why? You know?
Mhm,
Um, okay. I'm going to jump to number 3, which is housing and housing and discrimination, which we talk a lot in the book. History again, I'm quite familiar with. I had a mortgage loan origination license for a
mm,
brief amount of time, and we had to study the Fair Housing Act ad nauseum for good reason. And to me, and there's all these pieces that come together to contribute to income and wealth inequality in this country, but nothing I don't think comes close to the housing dynamic in terms of building equity generationally. And this is where I talk about how housing and education,
mhm,
not just in K through 12, are inextricably linked. You know, my dad helped me through college by taking out a line of credit on our home
right,
because he had equity. He went to night school for 10 years, and that
mhm,
was important to him. He didn't want me to have to work full time to go to school, but he had that home ownership with which he was able to do it. And one last personal anecdote in view, um, I'm convinced that there is an entire generation of people in, I guess, the Gen X community that actually do own homes who will only retire when through something like a reverse mortgage, like taking the equity
yes,
out of that's going to
mhm,
make a comeback. I know it had an ugly start in this world and got bad press, well deserved. I think they've cleaned some of it up, but I've talked to a real estate broker and he's already seeing it. Like I can either sell it and pay taxes and move somewhere, or I can just basically kind of quasi sell it to the bank and let me live there until I die. And because that is now going to be the overwhelming majority of my net worth with some IRA money.
right,
You know, everything outside of that I've used to put my kids through college, you
mhm.
know, and one through graduate school. But um, explain things like the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. Um, did that happen? Where's it at? That was a education for me in reading about that one section in your book.
Well, I don't think it actually
Happened.
yeah, I don't think it actually happened, yeah. And so one of the things that I try to do is, particularly in the last chapter, is to throw out lots of things that could work, right? So, the one of the things that I'm proposing with respect to K-12 education is something that then Senator Kamala Harris tried to introduce in the Senate. Didn't happen, but she was recognizing that there are some problems with the schedules between a child going to school and a parent that's working. If I could cycle back a little bit with what you were mentioning with housing,
Please.
um, we can't ignore, although I don't want to dwell on the past because the book is quite forward looking, but we can't ignore what happened in the 1940s and the 1950s if we want to understand what's taking place right now. So, a lot of people that are homeowners are only homeowners now because their parents or grandparents were able to buy homes low cost in neighborhoods where the homes appreciated in value, so that when the grandparent, for example, died, they then left the home, or the children most likely sold the home, and then they had generational wealth. They could use it to buy their own home, or they could use it to help their kids go to college. So the story that you just told us about you and your dad.
Right.
One of the other things that people don't think about now in terms of the college part, as if I recall, you said your dad said he didn't want you to have to work your way through college.
He
Well,
worked
the
full
reality,
time for 10
yeah,
years. Yeah.
he worked full time, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, it is virtually impossible
Possible.
to work your way through college.
Yeah.
Maybe a community college if you stay at home, but you're probably not going to be able to work your way through college in ways that you could have in the 60s or 70s. So we look at young adults now, sort of the examples that you were using with your kids, with my kids, with the age group of students that I teach both at college and in law school. Many of them are still living at home. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing if, you can get along with your adult children. But
Yeah.
if you have adult children that would prefer to move out and rent someplace or buy their own home, we're looking at a generation where that's not a dream for them. So they're just working on the assumption I may be living in my parents' home until I'm 30, 35 years old. And again, if if that's becoming our norm, we need to talk about whether we want that to be the new norm and what signal this country is giving to young adults.
Yeah, no, that's another in addition to the reverse mortgage, my other prediction is a return to generational living,
Yeah.
where it won't necessarily be one of my kids living with my wife and I, but they will be. It's they take over the house and we move
Mhm,
to the basement, and that's how all of us get through. Um, yeah, do you have any sense, like, I mean, there's some things going, we're talking about housing real quick
mhm,
and affordability. There's some things that are just screamingly obvious to me, like having these hedge funds and private partnerships and vulture funds buying up 25,000 homes in the suburbs of Atlanta, just basically controlling the market. How local politicians, regulators, officials allowed that to happen. And what do we and there the city of Berlin, I just saw an article, they banned it, just one city.
mhm,
They just said no mas, the correlation and the things that companies like BlackRock are doing where they go in, buy in bulk so they get a discount, literally sell it to another fund within the firm at a marked up price. That's almost fraud, like showing
mhm,
inflated returns, and then it's a monopoly on rental prices. Um, Other than that, because your other book is about housing, correct?
mhm. Yes.
What else as a country would you do if you had a magic wand and can change two or three policies tomorrow? Is it too tight environmental restrictions? Is it just land availability, water availability? Something we deal. I'm in Colorado. It's just
Mhm.
every time they put up a new development, I just go, "Where's the water coming from?"
Right.
But what are your thoughts on that? What could we do?
Yeah. So one of the things that the book does is try to say, this is what we can do at the federal level. This is what they need to focus on at the state level. So right now, in answer to your question, I'll focus on the local level. We need to look at zoning regulations. And a city that says, "Oh, no, we're perfectly happy to have a subdivision or a community where the housing sizes must exceed 3,500 square feet, and you have to be at least on a half acre, and you have to have a whatever number of feet or yards setback from the street." What
Right.
you're saying is you have to have a big house, and if it's a big house, it's probably going to be an expensive house, which means you are pricing out lower and middle income families or the communities that don't allow any type of apartments or duplexes or triplexes. And again, it's much more environmentally friendly to build an apartment. But boy, as soon as you try to build an apartment building, the existing neighbors, who are typically homeowners, come screaming. I mean, they organize, they show up at the zoning meetings, they have a lawyer, they have t shirts, they have signs, they have chants. And it's usually along the line of, oh, if you have that apartment, it's just going to be horrible. The parking is going to be terrible. Oh, it's going to be horrible. You're going to have our schools to be overcrowded. They never produce data to support that,
Yeah, it's just
but
NIMBY. Yeah.
it's just NIMBYism.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. You
Or
know,
I love, go ahead.
no, no, you go ahead.
I was going to say, well, you mentioned the environment. If people are genuinely concerned about the environment, so Houston is probably one of the best examples in Texas. We have lots of flooding in Houston, and it's because the developers paid no attention to the land that they were building on. So we have lots of places which should be deemed as unbuildable because they're in flood zones, but they've sort of the developers have found ways to be able to build in places where they shouldn't. So that's sort of one side. But the other side are when people are making up excuses. Oh, we need to leave this land open rather than have affordable housing. And they sort of hide behind Mother Earth. But what
Yeah.
they're really saying is, we don't want those poor people living anywhere near us.
That one of the godfathers of the environmental movement, Stuart Brand, wrote a book years ago, and it was perfect for Kick the Dogma. He basically took the opposite side of three arguments that people make, one of which was he said basically cities are the greenest way we can live, high-rise apartments, because then you leave all that open space
Yep.
out there,
Mhm.
and much smaller footprint per person. All right, let's jump to employment, work and income as part of your New Deal. Well, I'll just ask one question first, and then I'll let you talk about what you say in the book a little bit as part of your New Deal. What are your thoughts on a federal minimum wage? Living in the South, familiar with markets where $50,000 you might live like a king, and $50,000 you're sleeping on your friend's couch. What are your thoughts on the federal minimum on a federal minimum wage?
So a federal minimum wage is great to lift people out of poverty, but that alone won't lift them
Right.
into the middle class.
Exactly.
And
Right.
so there have been politicians, we're not going to call out anybody by their names, who've said, we need to have a living wage. Totally agree with that. That's
Right.
not the conversation I'm having in the book, though.
Right.
So we need it, but we need more.
Okay, so what do we need? What are you suggesting in the book under the employment section for the new middle class New Deal?
Again, we have to make a decision. Are we going to allow um, owners, are we going to allow capital to benefit from every aspect of the workforce? So I'll use a couple examples. Um, you mentioned that a lot of people are going to need to use their homes for their retirement security because they don't have retirement income. Well, there's no good reason that we should have allowed businesses in the 1980s to decide that they were going to shift from a defined benefit plan, which we commonly think of as a pension,
Right.
to a defined contribution plan, which is the alphabet soup of 401k, 403b, Roth IRA, those kinds of things. Because pensions protected workers, protected the retirement security of workers. Both of my parents were educators. Both of my parents currently get 2 deposits to their account every month because they have a pension, and they will get those deposits for the rest of their lives.
Yep.
The rest of us get, because we are now having to take our income to decide, so how much do I want to put in my 401k or 403b? How long do I think I'm going to live? How much income do I think I'm going to need in the future? What do I think my health care expenses may be in the future? Employers used to do that for their workers. They've now shifted all of the risk of retirement, all of the uncertainties with respect to retirement security onto workers. So that's something we need to talk about. We know there is going to be a retirement security crisis because we're going to be there in about 10 years. The boomers were the last generation that really could expect to have a pension. The rest of us are effectively self-funding and just sort of have to hope for the best. The other big difference that I point out in the book and whenever I'm talking about sort of labor markets, one big difference between a typical worker who either graduated from high school or college in the 1970s until the mid 1980s and contrast that to someone now is you are more likely now to be called a contractor
Right.
and not to be called an employee. So again, the example that I use all the time, probably the best example that most people are familiar with is Amazon. So we allow Amazon to have a fleet of workers to help make them profitable, but the workers are not called employees. They're more likely to either be independent contractors or they're going to be people that work for what's often called a delivery service provider. So you're not an Amazon employee, though you show up in the blue van, wearing the blue vest, dropping packages on someone's front porch. Because they are not statutory employees, they're not entitled to 40 hours a week, they're not entitled to any benefits, and they can't unionize. So if we need to look at why are we allowing businesses to have people that do the work that would have been performed by an employee in the 1970s or 1980s, but we're letting the businesses characterize them as something else in order to save cost.
Yeah, it's a gig worker. Is that the term
Gig well,
today?
actually, gig is even worse. That didn't exist at all in the 1980s. So the gigs are employed by the platforms, or even worse, if we think about people that travel, particularly if you travel and you stay at sort of, the higher end hotels, and you have used to have, like, a lot of room service, or you would, utilize the services of a concierge.
Right.
Well, now you don't do any of that. You have DoorDash to bring the food to your hotel, and so the human beings that work at the hotel and whatever their hotel services department is, or the restaurants, or they don't get the work anymore because it's the DoorDash driver bringing you a meal from whatever restaurant you found in the city.
Right. DoorDash drivers, Uber drivers, it's the
Exactly.
same idea. They're all 1099 employees left to
Mhm.
fight for themselves. You don't get health care, you don't get
Yep.
that, so you've switched from a defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan, but there is no defined contribution plan even available to you if you were
Exactly.
willing to fund it. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that is 100% true. I mean, yeah, my dad worked for, just because of his age, he worked for the last kind of generation of large US corporations that just
Mhm.
had a pension plan,
Yep.
and again, never got rich, but they were able to die in that home that they owned for
Mhm.
60 years, and really never worried. That's
Right.
the
That's
sickness that we all
exactly.
suffer
Mhm.
from, is the constant worry. Where's the
Mhm.
next paycheck coming from, the next rent payment, the next meal? Um,
And it's
what
generational worry.
Yeah. Oh,
And so
yeah.
if you think of, like, the people that are in their, late 40s, 50s, 60s, many of us are worried about our parents. Are our parents gonna run out of money? Are we gonna have to subsidize our parents' cost?
Right.
And we're worried about our children. Are our children ever gonna become economically stable? And, oh, by the way, we have to worry about our own lives. So it's just this constant, um, anxiety that a lot of people are dealing with right now, and a lot of people don't talk about it because you don't want to say, "I'm afraid I'm going to run out of money. I don't know what I'm going to do with mom if her money runs out."
Yeah, we're not to overshare, but we're at risk of that exact situation where my father-in-law is still alive. My parents are gone, but he's just about 10 years younger than my parents.
Mhm.
So he missed the pension wave, and but he had this big IRA, and he grew up very, very poor in Jonesboro, Arkansas, and $1.2 million. He couldn't believe how rich he was. Well, he was let go 30 years ago
Uh-huh.
and still has some left. I've worked my butt off, like, helping him manage that, but in the beginning, he was just spending because he just thought he was
Yep.
the richest guy in the world, and he just didn't have anyone to sit there and go, "Let's do the math here." You cannot spend
Right.
10% of this every year. You can spend about 4 and a half,
Uh-huh.
and you're gonna have to alter your lifestyle. But now that's become he went from thinking he was the richest guy in the world to not constant worry. I don't know if he thinks about it much yet, but I am,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
uh, what is, oh, I was gonna save this for later, but it's on income. Have you thought much about the prospects of UBI, universal basic income? I've seen some cities, I haven't gone deep on it, but every once in a while I'll see an article about a city that ran a test pilot, and they have very positive, measurable
Mhm.
results, it seems, for society when
Mhm.
they do it, and it really lifts people up. What have you seen or thought about when it comes to UBI?
I've never seen any city or state that has tried UBI that reports it was a failure.
Right.
It's been a success everywhere. I would also say, um, it's been a success nationally in this country, but we just didn't call it that. So when I have taught courses on the middle class, I've taught them before 2020, and I taught them after 2020. And before 2020, students would mention UBI, and one person would mention it, one student would mention it, and the rest of the class would say, "Oh, it couldn't work. People wouldn't want to get a job. It's too expensive. How do you decide who gets it? Blah 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 blah." And then that thing happened in the U.S. and around the world in 2020, known as the pandemic. We shut down the country and we just gave people money. And, we had different programs that were called different things that gave people money, but basically it was UBI.
Yeah.
And it worked.
Yeah.
The government did not come to a screeching halt. People, as soon as the checks ended, they were like, okay, got to go back to work now. Because most human beings like to work. That's one of the things that I talk a little bit about in the book is that a lot of people are judgy about middle and lower income workers, and
Yeah.
they think that they don't well, if you just worked harder, you'd be able to achieve the American dream. No,
Yeah.
that's actually
It's an
not a
awful
thing.
myth. Yeah.
It's an awful myth, exactly. So, wh I will never reject UBI. And I would suggest to the people that say it can't work, well, maybe you should go and look at the cities and the states where it has worked and then ask, is there any way we could scale that nationally?
Okay. Yeah, I agree 100%. And when you talk about in the book all the different programs that the government passed during the pandemic to keep us afloat and keep people sustained. And I just remember when it was happening and I was following the news around the world, there were countries, very, very, happy, healthy European countries that didn't need to pass a single
Mhm.
special bill. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
the programs were the programs.
Yeah.
They're already in place.
Mhm.
And anyway, that's dreaming
Yeah.
for now. But
Well, but it's again, the thing that I'm trying to do in the book is to make sure that political leaders stop saying, well, there's nothing we can do. This is just the way things are right now. And the first thing I say is, well, if that had been the approach with the New Deal, we never would have had a middle class.
never would have had it.
So let's just assume that we could create a new norm if we wanted to, either a specific U.S. programs and initiatives, or to your point, we don't have a robust social safety net in this country in the
No.
ways that they do in other countries. And I'm tired of the arguments, well, we're not like Sweden and we're not. Okay, but could we maybe look at their programs and say, given where we are right now as a country, let's go big and bold like we did during COVID, and it worked.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. And what is that concept of just best practices? Like, what
Yes.
is to stop you from going around the world and saying, okay, I like a little bit of what Sweden does, a little bit of what Denmark does, a little bit what South Korea does,
Mhm.
and let's pull that together and we can do that here. And then unfortunately, there's a whole nother hour discussion, which we can't have about the tax code and defense
Yeah.
spending and whether or not the money is there. It's absolutely
Mhm.
absurd. One of the things I didn't make this up, someone else said it, and the numbers could be off, but the point is if you went back 50 years, the tax code was, 400 pages. And
Mhm.
now it's 4,000 pages.
Right.
And the extra 3,600 pages are just deductions
Yes.
for the wealthy and
Mhm.
corporations. Basically, I call it a bribe, that
Exactly.
politicians give. And kind of white or blank page thinking, lateral thinking, Edward de Bono, just
Mhm.
imagine that, go back to the 400 pages and
Right.
start over and say, now justify this.
Mhm.
Justify the private jet deduction, the pro sports team deduction, whatever. But
Mhm.
if you wouldn't have to even change the marginal tax code to go back to what as you said, when things were amazing, when the golden age from post World War II up through the 60s, not always socially, but
Right.
economically, um, we don't even have to go back to those rates, even though it
Mhm.
worked just fine. If you just got rid of those deductions, what would happen to the budget? And get realistic with the defense spending. This is insanity.
Yeah.
We can blow up the
Mhm.
world 6 times over by ourselves. All of this is within our reach.
Right.
It's insane.
And the thing about the tax code, and we're not gonna talk about it because I'm not a tax expert, but
Right.
you can tell who and what a country values by looking at the tax code.
Yeah.
So those additional 3,600 pages, right? It's because they are valuing certain people or certain entities or certain things. And so my argument is if we all agree that we value the middle class, that we value having economic stability for people who get up, do the right thing, go to work, and just want to have a normal, stress free life, how would we rewrite the tax code? So that would be sort
Yeah.
of a thought process, right? But the tax gurus could get together and do that and say, okay, how would we do this if our main focus is making sure that lower and middle income people in this country aren't constantly struggling, aren't stressed, and aren't suffering?
Yeah. Yeah. And the next section is on the debt and the savings plan. And what triggered this idea was what you just said was tax people sitting down and I call it again blank page thinking. Imagine we didn't have anything. What would you want it to look like? And our leaders just can't think like that. We are just a nation of incrementalists, just
Mhm,
little tweaks, little add-ons, new bill, instead of saying, no, 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 no. Imagine we didn't have any of it. Cost is not an issue. Technology is not an issue. What would we want these programs to look like? It's all within our reach. And where that leads me to in this next question, because in the debt and savings plan, and you can talk as much as you want about the New Deal portion, but in the book, in the middle of the book, you talk a lot
mhm,
about healthcare debt and how crippling that is for people. I would have thought that universal healthcare in and of itself, just that one big concept would be in the top 5 of things that if we had a magic wand and we could do it to rebuild the middle class that we would want to do. What are your thoughts on, universal healthcare? Because I mean, you still have debt that's out there we'd have to deal with, but you wouldn't be
mhm,
making any new debt. You take away worry, you take away the issue of the gig workers not having health
mhm,
care. I mean, so many pieces of the puzzle. And I have health insurance to my wife. She works for Parks and Rec and it's
mhm,
considered pretty good, but I've been through a whirlwind in the last year and a half. And, these pockets of those Russian dolls that you pull one off and there's another smaller one?
exactly, yeah.
Those are the different buckets of things you owe. Like
Mhm,
I said, oh,
mhm,
$1,500 deductible. I'm going to blow through that in a few months and then I won't have to write another check. And then the bills keep
and then
coming and I
mhm,
finally analyze it and there's something called out of pocket. And I'm like, what the heck is that?
yeah,
Just so
exactly.
that was $4,000,
Mhm,
and as I said, that's a good healthcare plan. And what do
right,
so I just again, you go back to the notion of best practices, looking around the world and saying
mhm,
we like a little bit of what Switzerland does, a little bit of what Denmark does, a little bit of what Norway does. But what if you had no health care plan in this country today? We never had anything. We didn't have employer paid care. We didn't have anything. And in 2026, someone said we should have a health care plan. You would never in a billion years do what we have now.
right,
You would
right.
never create it.
So
But anyway, go ahead.
well, you said, we can look at Sweden, we can do a little bit from this country, a little bit from that country. I would also add, we could do a little bit we can look at the United States and say, if you are a military personnel, what kind of health care do you get? So in this country, we in fact do have do we in
Oh,
fact
my
have
brother's a
universal.
veteran. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
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 And if you are in the military, you have health care. You don't have to pay for your health care. Now, if you talk to someone that's currently in the military, is it perfect? They'll probably say no.
Absolutely.
Does it cover you and your family? Oh, yeah. It covers everyone. So again, when we're saying what can't be done in this country because it's not the way we currently do it, my response is, well, let's look back at the how we ended up with having so many benefits that are or so many services that are provided by your employer. And it was because during World War II there were wage controls. So you couldn't give workers a raise, but
Right.
what you could do was to give them non-wage compensation.
Benefits. Right.
Yeah. So once we linked or once we said that your retirement and your health insurance will come through your job, We now assume, well, of course it has to. How else would we handle it? I don't know. Maybe look around the world or look at the U.S. military and
Yeah,
say, and I'll tell us a story about this. And when I was
please.
teaching one of these middle class courses, I loved it. It was law students. It was a graduate level, except I also had several foreign exchange students. And so I'd break them up into small sections and give them questions to talk about. So, of course, in the week that we're talking about employment, I went by one of the small sections, and one of the exchange students from the Netherlands, she said, "So I'm just confused. Like every time in this class we talk about health insurance, you people keep talking about jobs. What does your job have to
Have to
do with
do with it.
anything?"
Yeah.
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 And it all of us, I mean, I knew that we were aberrational, but all of the others, students in the group went, "Well, how do y'all do it in your country?"
Right.
And so we need to have a lot of these. So, how do they do it in their country discussions? Because as you've, just articulated with the, and then there's the out of pocket, and don't go out of network and don't
No,
end up in
God
an
forbid.
ambulance. Don't
Right.
go in an ambulance,
Don't
right?
do that.
Uh,
Yeah.
and so rather than saying, well, this is the way we have it and it's awful, but it's ours, say, well, but how do those people do it? And maybe we could take a little bit of what they do to improve the lives of everybody here.
Yeah. That was another element of my, looking at European countries during the COVID lockdown was their jobs may have shut down, but nobody lost healthcare. That
Exactly.
that was a big one. And the other, it's funny, you talk about foreign exchange students. Two of my older three sons were very lucky to be able to study abroad, and
Mhm,
which is so great for them to open their eyes to the world. And
mhm.
the number one thing they came back talking about was public transportation.
Yeah.
And I think that is also a great equalizer in terms of income and
Mm,
wealth disparity. That it's bad enough. Okay, so I've got to live in this neighborhood. This is all I can afford. But my job, I have to have a car with a $400 a month payment,
mhm.
$300 a month in insurance, registration, and I get and you talked about it in the book, and the amount of times in this country where the government, demolished a thriving black neighborhood in order to put a highway through it,
Right.
you know, and that's just another layer. Again, I want people to read the book that aren't familiar, especially with that history and how we all got here. But
Mhm.
to have public transportation, to not need that car, to get to a job for $3. I mean, and when
Exactly.
you can go anywhere from to the airport and then hop for $49 to another country. I mean, it's it's crazy. Well,
Mm,
Michelle, listen, before we go, um, I'm new at this. I love the book. It was I'm old. I'm pretty well read, but I still learned a ton. And I
oh,
appreciate you for taking
thank you.
10 years to put it together and well, pivoting midway through because the world changed and you had to. And
Yeah.
that is one of the as a creator of content, that is always one of the most brutal things to do, to start over. But what would you want folks to know about this book and about this topic? Anything else that we didn't talk about, but to entice them to kind of think about how important this is and how attainable it is, how reachable it is.
Mhm.
So they'll get the book, they'll read it, and think about it. What didn't I ask that I should have, basically?
Well, I'll say that when I tell people when you read the book and when you ask, because I often get the question, well, what can people do? And my response is often be a single issue voter, not in a bad way, but in a good way. So take one of the chapters in the book, whether it is housing, K 12 education, college, employment stability, and ask, what can you do? What can you ask your political leaders to do on the state, the local, and the federal level to make it easy for people to get um, a better K-12 public education? Because I won't even go into charters are great as long as you live in a large urban area, because if you live in a rural area, there are no charter and voucher options. So
Right.
ask, what can the political leaders do in on just pick one topic, whether it's housing or employment, because it can seem overwhelming. And that's usually the response I get. Well, you seem so optimistic, Michelle. How can you be optimistic? And it can be done. It's just sort of you have to take it in bite-sized pieces.
It's so interesting. I scrolled down. I had one more question I was going to ask you on that very topic,
Mm.
which is to say, okay, Michelle Dickerson is not the next president, but you get invited to join the cabinet. And the next president calls you and says, you can have any cabinet position you want. And this is addressing just what you talked about. You would have to
Mhm.
make the decision out of all the things you know that need to be done to pick one: Department of Education, Health and Human Services, labor, whatever. And I don't know if this is fair or not, but
Mhm.
I came up with it, and you literally just catalyzed it with that last answer. What position would you take to have the biggest impact on the middle class New Deal?
Hands down, Department of Education.
There you go.
And I would have said Department of Education even before it became, um, uh, huh, restructured in the way that it currently has been. Some might say demolished, I'll say restructured, but
Yeah,
I would have picked that one even before the current changes, because if we don't help children give them a good footing before they turn age 18, for many, there is no hope.
nothing else matters nearly as
Nothing
much.
else matters. Mhm.
Yeah, and with that education, you can fight your way through a lot of stuff. I agree. I mean, where we live in Colorado, it's interesting. It's so different from Illinois, where taxes were high, but the public schools were fantastic.
Mhm.
Here, um, they because you talk a lot about we talked initially about how employment and education and housing are so linked because of where you
Mhm.
live. Your parents tried to live in a district with a good school where their homes are going
Right.
to appreciate all that forethought. um, they have open enrollment here, like, so
Hmm.
you can, if you can drive they have great busing within district. They're not going to bus you out of district, but if you're willing
Mhm.
to drive, you can you can take your kid to another public school that you think serves them better, which is one of the good things. Now, here's
Mhm.
one of the bad things, and you can use this joke if you want it. I compare public education in Colorado to flying Frontier Airlines. Okay,
Mm.
so it's real free. It's free
Mhm.
until you want to have lunch, take
Oh.
a science class with a lab, play a
Mhm.
sport, do an extracurricular activity. Those are all you get a bill.
Mhm.
And my wife showed me the first time, like, what the hell is this?
Exactly. Yeah.
These are all the things our kids do. I'm like, what, so
Mhm.
it ended up being a pretty, significant number. So that's
Mhm.
we don't spend a lot here. We're in the mid to low 30s on kind of spending 30 kids in a classroom. I think the teachers do a phenomenal job
Mm.
with what they have and what they have to deal with. And some districts out here do better than others. One of the things we ran into during COVID was, I live about 30 miles, I'm in a small mountain town about 30 miles outside of Denver. If you keep
Mhm.
going, our district, when the school shut down during COVID, everyone went online with
Right.
mixed results.
Mhm.
Well, 30 minutes further west of here, they didn't have high speed internet.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
They couldn't even do it,
Mhm. And again, that's
so
one of the things where you don't notice that you get a very different education depending on where you live, and sometimes that's luck, but a lot of it is where can you afford to live? Well, I won't go on this tirade, but the notion that so many states have basically decided to defund their public education, and they're relying on parents to do things because and I'm sure you remember those lovely days when you take your children back to school in August, and then you get this sheet and you need to provide this and provide
yep,
that, and then you
yep,
get the mid-year version. For
yep,
Texas, it's February. For Colorado, it may be October, and they need to provide tissues and Clorox wipes and all of these other things that the state should be paying for. I'm gonna use that frontier joke, because
yeah.
it is, depending on sort of what school you're in, it may seem like it's a free public education, but it's only free if you can afford to pay all of the extras.
That's it. And you didn't use the term, but in the book, I love that term, shadow education.
Mhm,
I've said since we moved here, I came up with another saying, which is, every kid is homeschooled in a way, whether it's
mhm,
understanding early decision for college, whether it's tutoring. For my wife just happens to have been a great student, and she is their tutor,
mhm.
because that's just, as I said, 30 kids in a classroom, teachers are kind of doing
Yeah,
the best they can. And then what really happens is my wife at home leaning over them every night,
yeah,
and nothing gets handed in until she's reviewed it.
mhm,
And candidly, that was the difference maker. So
exactly. Yeah.
All right.
And
Well,
it's
you
the shadow education that lower rich and rich kids get that many lower and middle income kids don't even know exist.
don't even know exists, 100%. And last anecdote in the public school here, and this is not well, we're rural, but this is not
Mhm,
rural poor. Um, when my oldest son was in eighth grade, I kind of figured, I was like, okay, I got to put 4 kids through college. Not sure how I'm going to do it. I looked at the schools that had the biggest endowments and actually used it for need.
mhm,
And I was pretty much like, we have to get into one of these 15 schools or you're
mhm,
going, to the state school, which is fine. We have
right.
great state schools. It's wonderful. Part of getting in there, the other math I did, and I know it's very, very controversial, but these are the rules of the game, is this early decision trigger, right?
Yes. Mhm,
And you just look at the acceptance rates, they publish it.
mhm.
And you're like, well, you
Yes.
have 2.5 times the probability of getting in if you go ED than if you don't.
Mhm.
So true story, Michelle. The local, you use the statistic in your book, right? 2 guidance counselors
Right.
for graduating for a school of 1,200 kids. Okay. So we went down there with the early decision. You need their signature. A lot of people
Yes.
have to say they didn't know what it was.
Exactly.
We
Mhm,
had to explain it to them. And when
mhm.
we did, we had to have a drag out screaming fight because they didn't want to sign it.
Right. Mhm.
I said, the hell you won't, you know,
Exactly. Yeah.
and that got him in and,
Mhm. I mean,
paid for
and
just doing the math and figuring it out.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And when we talk about, like, the college counselors that are in public schools, again, for kids that go to lower and middle income schools, they're lucky if they have a counselor for their grade,
Oh,
much
yeah.
less someone who is there, whose job it is to sign that ED form.
Right. Right. Well, Michelle, whether it's for president or Department of Education, you have my vote. And I love the book, The Middle Class New Deal, Restoring Upward Mobility and the American Dream. I can't thank you enough for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me on. I've so enjoyed this.
Thank you.